Kia ora, and welcome to round 6 of Campbelltown Australs. The two teams before me are debating the motion that, as the captain, we would wear one love. That motion came with an info slide, and the info slide read, "You are the captain of the Wales national team of football. Previously, you had publicly announced that you'll be wearing the One Love armband in the World Cup against its rules, which exhibits support for the LGBTQ movement in unity with 7 other nations in Europe. However, after FIFA's announcement that such act may cause the player to be booked or sent off, all teams have reversed their previous decision. You will play your second game of the group stage in a couple of hours." And again, the motion is that as the captain, we would wear one love. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome the first speaker of the affirming team.
Can you see and hear me? Wonderful. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in the speech. First, in terms of incentives. Secondly, in terms of the positive impacts. And thirdly, in terms of why ops impacts probably do not land preemptively. But before that, a fair bit of characterization. First, I want to be very clear about what the context of this occurring is, because the context of this occurring is Qatar making promises and then reneging on those promises. It looks like, for example, them saying that they'll allow alcohol, but then saying one day before the tournament, when everything has been booked and finalized, that they won't allow it. It looks like, for example, them promising FIFA that they'll allow people to fly rainbow flags and LGBTQ flags and wear LGBTQ merch, but they still marched this out of the tournament the day that it started completely. This comes in the backdrop of the fact that Qatar generally has not followed the promises and whatever it gave to the FIFA as a whole, and it's just been not in accordance with whatever was agreed upon, what people thought that they had agreed upon, and what people expected coming into the tournament. Secondly, this is not just Wales. You have 7 countries just going ahead and doing this, right? So this looks like very significant countries in football, like England, like the Netherlands, like Germany, that all have a large amount of media presence and all have a large amount of sway in the way that decisions are made in football, and more importantly, in the way that the public perceives this and the public considers the importance of like actions generally. But thirdly, and just an additional layer to add to this, is that these 7 countries that initially told FIFA that they'll be doing this months in advance, where FIFA didn't deny them this particular opportunity, but they made this announcement just on this particular day that they might get booked. Absolutely, they didn't actually bar them before the tournament at any particular point of time, other than just a few hours happening before the game. Finally, what is the general context of this? The general context of this is the fact that Qatar has faced significant amount of backlash for the fact that it does not respect things like LGBTQ rights, that it does not respect Western traditions of equality, and it sticks to its own cultural conception. FIFA has also come under a significant amount of pressure from this, though, and this framing is extremely crucial because of the fact that Infantino essentially went on stage and made an embarrassing speech about how he was a migrant worker and claimed the identity of incredibly large amounts of marginalized groups without any sort of shame or any sort of embarrassment. That puts FIFA in an extremely vulnerable state today, insofar as the fact that whatever FIFA says is now subject to an extreme increased amount of scrutiny, because not only did they give the World Cup to Qatar, not only are there allegations of corruption, but also the fact that now there's an embarrassing amount of like deference that has been given to Qatar, and FIFA isn't able to stand its own ground, and that's completely taking away the legitimacy of FIFA as a whole. With that being said, let's clearly characterize the incentives of what this player looks like. By the way, the player is Gareth Bale, just for like facts out there. First of all, winning the match and winning matches and generally going to the group stage is definitely a goal for Bale, etc., etc. But you have other incentives that Bale has as well, right? Just note secondly that you probably have personal value as Bale. That is just to say that you probably believe in the fact that LGBTQ rights should be protected and they should be granted equal status in society. The reason for this is generally extremely simple. Western Europe tends to be extremely liberal and progressive, especially if you come from younger generations. And it's also true because of the fact that you have media coverage talking about all of these things. You've grown up in a culture that believes that these rights should be protected and LGBTQ persons should not be facing discrimination at any particular level. You probably want to take personal actions to protect that in the very first place. But thirdly, and this is the most important incentive that you have as Bale, you are the single most important person in the team. You are the captain of the. You have been a former Real Madrid player who's won the Champions League. You are well known all around the world for your extremely speedy runs and for the fact that you were an excellent player generally. This means not only do you have large amounts of fans within Wales that pay attention to you because you're in the Welsh national team, but also the fact that they care about you because of your individual personal likability that currently exists. This does not, however, crucially only extend to normal fans. It extends to LGBTQ fans as well. That is to say, people who want to opt into football but aren't able to opt into football because of all the negative things that surround LGBTQ rights within the game. The moment at which you make this particular announcement, you're giving representation to those people. You're giving catharsis to LGBTQ fans who do not feel represented in the game. We think that's the big into what the positive impacts of this are. I think there's like three distinct things to note here. The first is you can start a discourse on sports washing generally. Because what happens currently in a lot of places is the fact that teams in the Middle East, for example, buy Premier League clubs and then use that to push their positive image. It looks like, for example, Saudi taking over Newcastle. It looks like the like Emirates, for example, sponsoring a large amount of City. This does not significantly change on either side of the house, notably because of the fact that these countries still have incentives to like give funds there. The delta, though, lies here in the fact that you're able to start some level of discourse because you're able to give some level of pushback against this particular measure. Because note, just like pushbacks aren't unheard of, right? Iran did not sing their national anthem during their very first game in respect of the fact that there were protests going on in their home country. So you're actually able to do this to a significant extent. You're then able to generate a large amount of discourse on this particular issue, larger than you're ultimately otherwise able to. Because if all of the other countries have pulled out, you're probably not able to get that discourse started off on the comparative. But when you get that started off, even if you don't get large structural change, you get some minor change that exists. First, you might manage, for example, convince Qatar to give money and compensation to the migrant workers that it was responsible for killing. It might look like, for example, making better decisions when choosing which country to host the World Cup in. This is likely to just also be like just fairly significant because of the fact that all of the media attention is focused on the football World Cup that happens once every 4 years, and there's billions of people around the world who are extremely interested in this particular thing. You're able to then generate this discourse exclusively on our side because what happens on negative is the fact that they completely bury the issue. No one wears the armband and no one talks about it in the media. They just talk about the game. By giving a contrary to a counter, you're able to get that started off in the very first place. I also suggest that your generally second impact just here is that you're able to actually actualize yourself as the role model that currently exists, because a lot of fans look up to you as that one player who represents my country. It's as that one player I'm going to be judged by if I tell that I'm a football fan and I'm from Wales. When you give those individual representation, when you give LGBTQ, when you make LGBTQ fans feel like they are part of the team, that they can be a legitimate supporter without being completely demonized, that is an extreme large positive impact for them. And these individuals are the most vulnerable people that exist within these fan groups generally. And I think it's just great that we're able to cater to them by directing them by this particular announcement. Know that you actually also have things like financial effects, right? If you're not doing this, fans just stop doing things like buying merchandise and coming to your matches because of the fact that younger fans in Europe especially tend to be like grown up in cultures that are extremely progressive. Younger people tend to be progressive generally. They generally adopt all of these things. If you go to the point at which you just completely quit doing something you're planning to do for months because you were scared of getting booked, that is going to have a negative downturn in terms of financial impacts that you're getting. Probably don't want that to happen as somebody who cares about the country that they're playing for. That just means that you have a positive impacts that you have on our side, that negative just not do so on this. But they just preempt a lot of material that they can probably come up with, right? They just come up with like, Wales is like, this is not going to create any kind of positive discourse because only Wales is involved in this particular conversation. I would suggest first you actually make this one step to other countries agree as well, because if those 7 countries see that there's at least one player from the Welsh national team going ahead and doing this, they'll be likely to do so. Germany might be likely to do so. Like the Netherlands might be likely to do so. England might be likely to do so. That's extremely crucial because of the fact that then you can start off a snowball and start off a larger chain of conversation. Even countries like Germany and France that aren't involved directly in this discourse, but aren't completely opposed to it either, will be more likely to opt in and do this in their own future games to highlight the fact that these LGBTQ rights are just not being protected as a whole. This means you're able to then positively talk about this in terms of a higher amount of like, and like just like talk about this generally. You also have public perception and media discourse that these countries probably want to opt into. They probably don't want to be demonized by the media for not protecting LGBT rights and for not standing up to their values. Fans don't really like that. But second, they might be like, this is going to impact Wales' performance in the match. First note, it's been confirmed in booking, so it's a yellow card, so you can still continue to play. But even if it's not that, even if you get sent off the field, we suggest it's not an extremely large harm. Because first of all, you're playing Iran, which you probably have a reasonable chance of winning against. But secondly, that's both inherently unpredictable. The fact that you don't know who might get injured, the fact that you don't know how training is going to be, you might not fitness players that happen. Germany literally lost to Japan. Argentina, that was on a 36-match unbeaten run, was beaten by Saudi Arabia. This just shows inherently that this is probably not the delta in this particular debate, because winning matches is extremely uncertain. The delta is that you manage to have a discourse around it, you manage to make fans feel represented, and that's why you should propose.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the first negating speaker.
Hello, can I confirm that I'm audible and visible? Okay. If at any point in time I'm not audible loud enough, kindly just put it in the chat. I will consider trying to be louder. Just give me 10 seconds. I'll set up my timer as well. All right, starting in 3, 2, and 1. Panel, I think that government never really considers the amount of risk that is upon it and the opportunity cost that they have to trade off. They just assert that it's okay to probably trade it off because LGBTQIA representation is important and that fans are important. Whatever they miss out here is two things. One, these are exactly the fans that are also fans of football and not just LGBTQI members. So it's also important to consider their interest as a football fan, probably supporting the Welsh team, or probably just a fan of Gareth Bale as a whole. But secondly, it's also important to understand the kind of opportunity cost that rides on the Wales team for this specific match. Because note two things here. Firstly, what is the historical context of the Wales team with regards to the World Cup? But secondly, what is the context of Gareth Bale and what kind of a pivotal role does he play within the Wales football team, right? Couple of pieces of characterization that government chooses to miss out in this debate uniquely for their case, right? First things first, I think Gareth Bale as a whole is a really pivotal player within the Wales football team, primarily because he's one of the strongest players that has like better experience, primarily because of playing in Real Madrid. But secondly, note that Wales football team has primarily gotten the chance to play the World Cup almost after 70 years of not having played it. It then means that this is a unique chance for them to probably go ahead and represent themselves as the Wales football team in the World Cup. What then is important, right? Because note the kind of risks that exist in terms of just having to wear the One Love armband. That is not to say that you would not support the LGBTQIA movement. So I think we're going to tell you three claims coming from side opposition. First, in terms of why then, based on the opportunity cost, it's okay to probably trade off not having to actively wear the One Love armband and probably rely on other things. Secondly, we'll tell you what other alternatives exist and why they're probably better, at least in terms of less risk, but also thirdly, in terms of why they're better off in creating better amount of change as opposed to the minimal delta of change that government has shown to you in this debate thus far. Firstly, then, I think one, there is a significant amount of interest to achieve great things for the Wales football team, and that is still a proximate interest for Gareth Bale to do so, and as well as the whole Wales football team, right? Firstly, then, I think given that how do like Welsh football team people see their football captain, and a lot of the fans also want Gareth Bale to be able to prioritize something like representation within the football team and not just prioritize like LGBTQI representation. So it's also important to be able to play these matches in the first place instead of having to like get multiple yellow cards because of the fact that you like did not listen to the FIFA World Cup rules this season. And that kind of representation is still something that is important. So even if it's one yellow card, probably you get booked off, but the second yellow card means you don't get to play the match. This is important to note because the second match that is coming up in the group stage is still like against Iran, but the next coming match is also against England, right? These are important matches. Sure, you could probably win against countries like Iran, and there's a strategic chance of winning that, even if Gareth Bale gets booked off. But then in the further coming matches, if you continue to wear this One Love armband, you're likely to like lose out on other matches, specifically the more important ones against England. Note that it's probably important for Wales to qualify as the team in this World Cup season. What then is the claim that come from Gov thus far, right? They tell you that, hey, it's probably okay to take that risk because it's important to represent LGBTQI people. Firstly, I think insofar as these are also football fans, they do care about you also having football representation. I think most people are okay with trading off their personal interest insofar as one of their bigger personal interests is also the football game. So I don't think you can try to please all in all. But secondly, it's also important to like looking forward to play and making sure that you're not risking the game far too much. But secondly, right, I think this is not the only World Cup that probably exists, which means that there are other World Cups like the next World Cup in USA, where you could probably still wear the one love armband if you wish to, right? So this is not like the only chance in choosing to represent this. But the second claim I want to make is that I think even if these football fans are people of the LGBTQ and want to make sure that they are represented equally, I think they'll understand, right? Because this is not a personal choice that because even if I could, I am not doing it. This is about I absolutely cannot, and they understand the risk that is in your position, and they will be okay with probably considering that it's the FIFA's fault and it's the fault of the Qatar World Cup and the fault of those rules in the World Cup, and it's not your individual fault, and will probably still support you in your regard. So in things like buying the merch, I think they'll probably still do these kind of things. But then the second piece of analysis, which is about the alternative methods that probably still exist, right? Because know what government tells you, right? They say that if you like probably get booked off, it's fine. But like if you like probably get taken out of the match and not allowed to pay the match, that's like worse off, right? they agree and concede to the harms and the risks that exist. Which then means, let's say you're probably able to like show off the One Love armband in this one match, but then the risks become significantly higher coming later down the matches, which means at best, their impact stands on probably having to wear this one at a time. But their second claim is also to say that other countries will do this. So what have the other countries done so far? And that'll bring me to the second argument on alternate method. Germany already has had a game to play in wherein like during the national anthem, they just covered their mouths and had significant pictures of this circulated around. I think government should like really watch the news recently, right? Which is that fact that like they covered their mouths to show their voice of dissent, and the fact that their voices have been curbed and they don't have that kind of freedom of expression. So I think if the rule specifically is about not being able to wear the One Love armband, I think you can bend around the loopholes of these rules, right? You can still show physical displays of like dissent. You can still show physical displays of the fact that your voices are being curbed, and that is something that still exists. A lot of people individually as well, for like in supports of the BLM movement in the past, have like gone down on one knee and have like significant amount of silence, like 1 minute silence, and all these kind of alternatives still exist. What's the second alternative that is also more effective, right? Using social media, because the social media is literally your own personal individual space. And if Gareth Bale is someone that wants to like project his personal opinions in terms of the fact that he's a supporter of the LGBTQI movement and wants to cater to their interests and understand the kind of rights that are being curbed against them, he can talk about it on social media. You can still go ahead and call out on social media the kind of things that FIFA World Cup is doing, the way it's curbing rights, and the fact that like holding a Qatar World Cup was probably a bad decision to do in the first place. Whatever, however, like the thing that government cannot claim, and is absolutely ridiculous to claim in this case, is like, why is this important, right? Because even if you do this kind of sacrifice and take this massive risk upon yourself, you're not guaranteed any kind of outcome, because the impacts that they claim at best are speculative. They don't necessarily show to you why with all of these things that FIFA is going to be able to convince Qatar to want to change these policies and rules. If for 10 years down the line, those specific citizens within Qatar have not been able to garner these changes, I don't know why already like FIFA World Cup already being held in Qatar, and given that Qatar has already been granted this FIFA World Cup, mid FIFA World Cup, trying to do all of these things is suddenly going to make Qatar want to change its world laws, right? Because the problem here is it's probably still going to look like two things. One, it looks like a Western person from a privileged group of class talking about how they should want to change their laws in these nations, right? It looks like Western washing of their culture. They're probably going to become more defensive and still run the narrative within their countries that these are white people trying to wash our cultures and it's okay to not support LGBTQI individuals. That's the kind of claims that they're going to be making within these countries. I think government has the burden to show why just like wearing the One Love armband gets more effect, right? Which then means that the alternate methods are probably still more effective and reduce the kind of massive amount of risk that you have to take like on-site government, right? Because note that the risk is still high, right? It's important for you to show that you are still a representative for your country in terms of being able to represent the country in the football club, being able to represent them in the football World Cup, right? But it's also important to show that you're able to like get the good game, because note that Gareth Bale as a captain is a very pivotal player, just being in terms of being able to score the goals, being able to manage the team. So even if they are going to like take up any kinds of risk, I think that risk analysis has to be something that is done accurately and not something that like government cherry picks on their side of the house. All of that couldn't be more proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the second affirming speaker.
Yep, just confirming. Can you hear me? All right. Sounds good. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Why is this symbolic and why is this something likely to affect Bale? Because this is an actor motion at the end of the day. Firstly, nobody in the German team publicly announced that they're essentially going to wear the one-arm armband. Read the info slide. Gareth Bale openly publicly announced that he's going to do it, pointed which like Wales play their first match, which means this is largely has to be seen from the perspective of an actor and the repercussions that's going to happen on Bale, pointed which he backtracks on like on, say, for example, the public announcement that they essentially made. But secondly, I think Bale has been an equivocal supporter of LGBTQ rights across Wales, because this is largely due to the fact that the Welsh population is largely towards the center left of the political spectrum. You have the Labour Party in Wales that's been continuously winning elections. Wales has got one of the most progressive laws in terms of LGBTQ and same-sex marriages, which means at that point of time, it's a very liberal space that essentially exists. It's not only about LGBTQ fans, it's about everyone who's on the left of the political spectrum. There's a vast majority of those people who are out there, and considering the political setup and what the Welsh population largely is inclined towards, this is largely likely to be the vast majority of the people. Secondly, you can do this in other ways, and this is what the strongest possible off claim, I would say, exists. Firstly, you can't, because the eyes of the world are on you right now. That is to say, like, there's been a huge discussion in terms of, say, for example, LGBTQ rights in Qatar. Literally everyone is talking about it. Like, that's why maybe the CAP team set this up. Or you literally had the German team essentially doing it as they claim, which means it's a big issue. Most newspaper headlines are essentially claiming it. At that point of time, considering that the eyes of the world and the maximum viewership is right now on you, at that point of time, I think doing any other thing essentially is not going to get as much amount of optical recognition or the optical backlash as they want to claim to be. But secondly, the amount of backlash that's going to be generated here is going to be insanely huge towards, say, LGBTQ fans in the first place, because they can't simply say it's being done by the Qatari government and not like by Bale, because Bale publicly took on the responsibility that he's going to essentially wear the band. But secondly, you have media that essentially is going to use this for TRP purposes. You're literally going to then paint Bale as the offender and essentially say the guy essentially backtracked on his word and essentially did not support the LGBTQ community who he thought is so close to him. That's going to be the front page of every other news headline that's going to come out tomorrow, which means at that point of time, the newspapers are not going to put this in a very egalitarian manner and blame the state, because like that's not the visibility that you can cognitively imagine, mostly as like a normal reader. A normal reader would say that Bale promised to do it, Bale backtracked on it, that's why Bale is the hypocrite. That's the most like easiest deduction that they can make, and most news media outlets run on the lowest common denominator and not on like complex interpretation of things, because that's less easily palatable. That point of time, Bale is largely likely to be criticized by, say, for example, individuals largely in general, mostly by the own liberal population back in his own country that he cares the most, because they're mostly on the center left of the political spectrum. When they see them essentially backtracking on the biggest possible stage that's out there after making a public announcement, because it's even magnified, because on their own premise, they said Wales is competing in the World Cup perhaps first time in the 70 years. That's how big it is for them as well. At that point of time, we think that the eyeballs that this is going to generate is not something that Bale is going to get able to sidestep off, and the amount of backlash is going to get is immensely huge. I'll get to that exclusive benefit towards the end of the speech in terms of why this is important. But secondly, I think their major benefit throughout their entire neck case is to say, well, Bale needs to play because we need to win or in subsequent matches. First piece of analysis, and I'm going to be a bit technical here. Firstly, it's not sure whether the referee is going to pull the yellow card out or not, because it's not something in the rule book that you have to do. If that was the case, then you would have like pulled it out for all previous matches and instances in the Champions League, etc. Which means it's still a level of ambiguity where the referee is going to essentially go ahead and do this at the end of the day or not. Few reasons perhaps the referee is not going to do it. Because one, mostly because if he goes ahead and does it, it's the same problem. The same referee is going to come out in the newspaper headline tomorrow saying like, this is the person who was anti-LGBTQ and essentially did this. But the first referee to essentially have done it in history is a huge amount of TRP tipping point for any media organization, which means it's largely going to taint the referee's image to the extent that the referee is not being able to essentially say, for example, referee matches subsequently in Europe. And literally, this is the highest possible upward social mobility that you can get either as a player or a referee to essentially referee in the UEFA Champions League match or in the Premier League, which are the richest clubs, which are the richest leagues in the world, which means when your image is going to be tainted so hard as a referee that you're going to be literally called out by all the Western media houses, mostly in Europe, that this debate is about. At that point of time, you also want to care about your image as well. I'm not too sure why then the referee is going to unequivocally follow FIFA's orders. But secondly, FIFA is also not the most powerful thing in the world. Like, this is literally saying ICC is the most powerful thing in the world. I'm just going to do a bit of cricket analogy. BCCI is the most powerful thing in the world because BCCI runs IPL, that is the richest thing in the richest cricketing league in the world. Comparatively, we would posit that the Football Association of England is the most powerful thing in the world because literally the Barclays Premier League is valued at over $9 billion. I think at that point of time, it's very unlikely that FIFA can't take your job away, because point at which when you have an FA accreditation, you can still continue to referee in matches. So at that point of time, the referee has very less to lose, but point at which when his image gets tainted by the media, at that point of time, it's very less likely that the FA or these big leagues are ever going to let him allow. That's the reason first why he's perhaps not going to pull out the card. But secondly, even if he does that, one, it is firstly going to be a yellow card, which is not going to be sent off from the match. Secondly, if they think Bale is so crucial, Bale knows that as well, which means Bale is going to be more careful to essentially not tackle randomly to get the second yellow card. But secondly, Bale is largely a striker and not a defender, so very less likelihood that Bale is like gonna tackle anywhere and get that second yellow card, and which means this is again speculative largely. But finally, even if that happens, I'm not sure why Bale existing means that Wales is going to win the match, because Bale is largely towards the end of his career right now, like 33 at this point. I'm just unsure why Bale becomes the crucial factor for Wales to win the match. If people literally care about the Wales team doing well, as they claim, which means at that point of time, if Messi can lose to Saudi Arabia, if Germany can lose to Japan, then football being as unpredictable as it is, there's no guarantee that Bale is going to win them the match. Also, I can posit that Aaron Ramsey, who's played more than 260 matches for Arsenal, can also score the goal and win the match for Wales. So which means winning the match is not something that they can claim as a benefit, or doing well in the match also, because that's highly subjective anyway. Like, perhaps you lose to Iran and Croatia anyway in the next two matches is not a clear benefit in this round. What is the clear benefit in this round? Why do we win? Firstly, I think the first thing that you need to do is to prevent the identity dissonance and not show your back towards the most vulnerable fans who cared for you the most. These LGBTQ fans supported you when you were young, literally came to your stadiums to watch your match when you played for Tottenham Hotspur, literally showed you, like, seen you grow as a person in the Premier League, watched your matches at Santiago Bernabeu when you essentially scored for Madrid. These are the fans that essentially cared for you when you essentially were coming up the ranks, bought your merchandises, supported you on social media, followed every possible thing that you did. You backtracking on them, and literally we told you that's the majority of the population in Europe and largely his own home country. At that point of time, this is principally abhorrent because you essentially do that. But secondly, it's also pragmatically bad because at that point of time, the amount of backlash that you generate from this is also likely to be insanely huge, because you essentially backtracked on the most important thing and the word that you essentially went for. Because as Debayan talks to you, players are not essentially people to score a goal in a match. They're greater than that. They're essentially role models or identities that you want to emulate. The very fact that Bale is one of the greatest players in history means people look up to him not only as someone to score a goal, but also as a role model and identity that they can emulate, somebody that they can look up to. If you point at which when you taint that image, it's very difficult to fix that subsequently, and that's a bigger harm that you essentially bring onto yourself by creating that identity dissonance, which is very less likely that fans are likely to support you then subsequently, because it's a clear harm. You playing in the match does not ensure that you're going to win the match, but you not putting that armband essentially means that you're going to backtrack on the promise that you made. Last thing to then say is in terms of largely issues that you can also talk about. I think this is also relevant. It's not like you can completely stop Qatar's whitewashing across the world. It's largely to say you can still have debates and discussions. Say like the migrant workers who didn't get equal compensation, but point at which when this was brought up in a discussion, Qatar promised that they're going to pay the migrant workers equally, which means you're never going to have these debates and discussions subsequently. Next time, perhaps, God forbid, if the World Cup is held in Saudi Arabia, because at that point of time, once you sidestep an issue and think this is not significant enough, it's going to roll into all the other issues subsequently, and FIFA is going to then get a clean sheet to always screw over the vulnerable people and the most vulnerable fans that exist in this game for those reasons.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the second negating speaker.
Yep. Am I audible? Hope I am audible. Yep. Great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. This is the first World Cup Wales is playing after 60 years. This is also the first World Cup Bale is playing. Bale, as a player, has been part of Wales for the longest period of time, and he has ditched countries like England to play for Wales, even if he could have chosen England. He was that passionate about winning this, being with the country for the longest period of time. That's what Bale as a player is. We think as a motion, this house as a captain, we have to first look at what Bale really wants. A few things here. One, Bale wants to do well for himself, but more importantly, lift his country up. But secondly, and more importantly, he wants to ensure that he has the fan following which he necessarily wants. But thirdly, even if magically he's one of the best advocates for LGBT+ community, as without mechanization, government necessarily claims, we think there are better alternatives. First, what does Bale really want? One, it doesn't matter if he gets a yellow card or not, or the second yellow card, or he tackles or not. People generally tend to be risk averse, which means that he necessarily doesn't really want to take the risk at a point of which he's trying everything in its own capacity to try to win this World Cup for Wales. But also more importantly, right, it's untrue that strikers don't tackle. I think on technical basis, like strikers necessarily have to tackle at the point of which there is certain sort of counter attacks at a point of which you have to tackle from the back. These are called strategic tackling. They are called taking a red card, taking a yellow card for the team. But also more importantly, right, The fact that he will be averse to tackling to people instead really affects his game, right? Because of the fact that he cannot probably dive to get a penalty, which nowadays people do in the longest period of times, right? All of those things means that it restricts the game. But even if they can suddenly prove it doesn't, the fact that people itself are risk averse means that he would not want this to affect his game in the first place, which means that he really wants to be set up. But secondly, and more importantly, right, they said that you don't know what's going to happen in the game. Sure, but as Bale, as the captain or as the best player in the team right now, you want to maximize your chances. So better probability of you winning is by playing in it, right? Doesn't mean that Argentina suddenly decides that, hey, we lost to Saudi Arabia, means we are shit. Messi, please sit down on the bench. We will handle with Poland because you don't really matter. Anything can happen really, right? Like nihilism doesn't really suddenly help like football teams. I think that's fucking stupid. More importantly, like fans, right? Like, let's understand how the fans necessarily perceive it. Firstly, in terms of Bale backing out and this necessarily affecting fans. They're not like necessarily proof that these people are more progressive than their football fans, right? Because Chesta only talks about that more often than not, people can be both. Like I am a part of LGBT, like I can be advocate for LGBTQ plus community, but I still want to watch football, right? But secondly, and more importantly, let's assume their best case. Like these people are tremendously liberal, extremely unsure how you define fans, like justify fans taking that step. Because their impacts are literally nothing, right? Because wearing that armband necessarily doesn't change anything, in Qatar, but B, doesn't change anything in terms of its own FIFA policies, right? Notice the amount of mechanization they have given, the fact that they will probably start negotiations. Why? Like the backlash around Qatar has been from last 12 years when the bid was given to Qatar. Nothing really has changed in terms of negotiations with Qatar itself. Extremely unsure why Bale wearing an armband necessarily is the tipping point, right? Which means that it's extremely hard for you to justify fans how exactly wearing that fucking band is going to be the tipping point to make better rights for the LGBTQ plus people. But secondly, and more importantly, the way people are perceiving this in the status quo, you literally get to say that I wanted to wear the armband, but it cannot affect the chances of my own country's hopes. I think at that point of paradigm, you necessarily shift the culpability towards FIFA, who is actually culpable for this. But thirdly, and more importantly, right, there are much better ways for you to explain this move itself. I think it's much more powerful for you to come out in a press conference and say that I am an advocate for LGBTQ plus community, but the corrupt FIFA organization and Qatar doesn't really necessarily allows me, and I think that's bad. That creates more backlash, that creates more conversations, because it goes directly to the tipping point of who exactly is culpable to it, right? You necessarily get to call out FIFA, who has necessarily caused this harm in the first place. I think that is tremendously important, right? But thirdly, and more importantly, notice how all our other alternatives necessarily deal with this. Already talked about one, right, which is going to the press conference. But secondly, like Germany necessarily wanted to wear the armband, they were not allowed. Manuel Lopez, they covered their mouths, right? They literally got to say that we do not have freedom of voice in this sort of World Cup. That creates conversations without affecting your chances. So how do you want to weigh this debate, right? If for the most important thing for Bale is his own country's success in the first place, right? Because their amount of explanation of why Bale is suddenly progressive and advocate for the LGBTQ plus community is extremely weak, rather than just saying that he publicly announced that he will do this. He did this in Euro 2022, extremely unsure that why it is the tipping point and first priority for Bale as a player in the first place. We think it's likely to understand that he's probably a football player, especially for Wales, after ditching a country like England for playing, and like probably ditching his ambitions for playing for Real Madrid and prioritizing Wales over anything else, right? Keeping himself fit, making sure he goes to MLS where he's not worked out, all of those things he has done to make sure that he does well for Wales, right? So it is fair to assume that his prioritization is playing football in the first place. But even if it's not, even if it's about LGBT plus community, we think where there is more propensity for change. We think that the propensity for change or the fact is something in which you necessarily as an actor care about keeping your fans, but at the same point of time, do the right things you want to do, right? Because there is no principal obligation on Bale to advocate for these kind of things. The way you do that is by talking about this in things like social media and so on. Their argumentation is Qatar World Cup is happening right now. Yes, sure. So hashtag Qatar World Cup, I'm not allowed to wear an armband. I think at that point of paradigm, you create that discourse which they necessarily want to talk about. They necessarily have to show the unique mechanism which LGBTQ plus changes, right? But lastly and more importantly, like more like trivial things which they talk about, like media pounces on Gareth Bale. extremely unsure why that's the case, right? Because the same media which they talk about, the Welsh media, is also part of the football community in which this is historically important. But secondly, and more importantly, like just imagine like how you exactly want to prove Bale culpable for this, because this is a person who wanted to wear the armband. The only reason why he's not, it because it affects his fucking job. I think at that point of paradigm, if someone tells me that you will not win a debate if you advocate for something, it's extremely fair for me to not advocate for a second, right? But use other mechanisms for if I'm someone who probably cares about this, right? I think it's tremendously stupid coming from them. But lastly, in terms of ideas of referees and so on, I think like I can choose to engage with this by saying that, hey, referee has to do this because this is literally the FIFA rule. So like he gets fired if he doesn't do this. But more importantly, referees are supposed to follow the rules, so they will do this. But secondly, no one else has tried, so we don't know what's going to happen. But again, like that's not the important thing, right? Which is to say that this motion is about what Bale thinks was gonna happen, right? Which means that he doesn't want to put his Bale's chances stakes in a platter and think that what is gonna happen and go on. But thirdly, like you can win against Iran without Bale. Again, that's all is irrelevant, right? You increase the probability at a point at which you think as the captain you should be playing. This is what Bale thinks and not exactly you looking at from a third eye perspective. How do you want to weigh this debate? Firstly, like priorities of Bale. I've already talked at length about this. It is more likely that he cares about playing football, but even if he wants to advocate for this, there are way more alternative mechanisms. One of them looks like what Denmark FA is doing right now, working with England, Wales, and all other Netherlands FA by like threatening FIFA that they will pull out if this is something which doesn't happen. This is more important, and this is more likely to cause change because this is internally causes change by FIFA, and FIFA would be forced to do this because there's monetary incentives involved. All of those things, you can probably back those kind of moves rather than affecting your playing, right? But more importantly, if you care about your fan and your fan following, which is the most important one for football fans necessarily care about the football more than LGBTQ. But even if they care about these things both at an equal pedestal, they necessarily do not see any propensity of change which happens by wearing the armband. But if they care about more about LGBTQ than football, I think Bale gets to justify this is FIFA's fault and not mine. But I'm more proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. I welcome the third affirming speaker.
Hi, am I clearly audible? All right. Starting in 3, just a second. Is there some background noise? Yep, I figured.
You're audible.
Cool. I think I can just I hope you can hear me over the background noise, if that's good.
Yeah, we can't hear any background noise. You're all good.
Okay, cool. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. In order to successfully counterprop a motion from opposition, you need to prove either counterprop is exclusive and comparative. If the interviews can exist on our side of the house as well, if you can trend social media hashtags on our side of the house as well, I am not sure then what delta they create by solving the problem on their side, because it's literally symmetric. We just get n+1 advantage on our side. We are getting everything that they say, but we're also doing the one love armband, right? But why one love armband? And this is crucial. Note that the current controversy is just around this particular idea. This means that this particular mechanism of going ahead and dissenting or putting a voice out there is the most highlighted. And you as a person have literally gone ahead on record to say that you were going to wear this in the first place, right? But before I get into any of that, I just want to note what Bale is, right? He's 33 years old. He's playing in the MLS, which is literally the graveyard of good football players. I think he already knows that he's past his prime. Real Madrid does not want him. Tottenham Hotspur doesn't want him at this point of time. So what Bale does exactly brings to the Welsh national team is that it's the symbolic image or the repute that he brings of like him being a top player at one point. Same goes for Ronaldo for that matter. He's way past his prime, still playing for Portugal because he's literally Ronaldo. I think those kind of symbolic values, those kind of abstract values that you bring to the table matter much more to the team as a unifying factor for the team, or you being the captain who can rally the team behind you as a leader, as opposed to you being the star player who can score most amount of matches. Bale does not have great form in international matches for that matter. So I'm not really sure what tipping point they can actually prove for their probabilistic analysis to even stand in this debate of why you'll win the match at the end of the day. I think for Bale himself, the ability to care about your job depends on two things. One, you probably, as any human being, you care about your job because you get money from it. But second is prestige and the symbolicism of you getting catharsis from that particular job, right? On money, I don't think that's a problem for Bale altogether. He's literally playing in the MLS. But secondly, the symbolicism and the message you can send is something that you want to hold on to. This is where the idea of national identity becomes so very important. Note that the national identity of Bale himself and Wales itself has been built on center-left policies for literally the longest period of time. They literally have legalized same-sex, gender change and same-sex marriage and adoption rights for LGBTQ people in that particular country. It's literally a country of progressives, and it's safe to assume that Gareth Bale is also progressive because of the very statement that he made in the first place. I think reneging on that particular promise, it means exceptionally bad PR for him at the end of his career. I think that bad PR just takes away his Instagram followers, or literally just goes ahead and fucks over his sponsorships if he literally goes ahead and reneges on the same promise that he made. I think all corporates also want to just get on the woke bandwagon. They literally go ahead and sponsor people, or give just put those faces of those sports players on their advertisements who are generally woke. But if you project yourself to be woke, I think staying consistent with that particular wokeness becomes more important for you if you want to succeed in your PR building, because that's the most abstract thing. I think at that point of time, the idea of you winning matches already goes out of this debate, because you know that you probably are not going to change the match in any way. But I just empirically it's false, because you, as any human being, you can't predict the outcome of any match whatsoever. They'll say that, hey, listen, it's a marginal increase in probability. To what extent, to what quantification does this probability change? I am not really sure. If Argentina can lose with Messi, who literally has 7 fucking Ballon d'Ors, I'm not really sure how Bale can literally go ahead and win you every goddamn match, right? They don't tell us why this uncertain probability that they talk about is going to be a delta in this debate, because if it's so uncertain, then it can't really be a delta at all. What we do get on our side, this is where I weigh up our arguments, is the weighing of is the messaging that we sent, right? And here's a certainty of impact of that messaging. I think since it's a hot topic and all eyes are focused on captains' armbands, the discussions around this particular thing will just boom out of proportion when you do wear and when you do define FIFA's guidelines or whatever, right? I think at that point of time, the traction for you increases as a person, but it also snowballs into much bigger social media discourse. I think you getting traction as a person is just good for your PR, good for your sponsorships and your contacts. I think that just helps you as a person to put out your word to a larger group of audience at that point of time. Positive discussions can literally overpower any backlash. But before I get into why on gravity and on scale we're likely to also win this debate, I just want to note this idea that, oh, listen, referees are forced to go ahead and give you yellow cards. I think the context slide clearly states that you may be booked, right? It does not say you'll surely be booked. Maybe means that there's an ambiguity and it's not a hard rule in the FIFA rule book. Maybe means that the referee can choose whether they want to go ahead and book you at that point of time. But even if you want to not buy that, I think a yellow card is still something that you can play with. I'm not really sure then on to what extent they can change the match's outcome on their house at that point, right? But second weighing metric, coming back to it, on gravity, I think the most important, most vulnerable people in this debate are the LGBTQ people, right? Note at all points, we get the N+1 benefit for them by getting all interviews and all the jazz they talk about in counter prop. Plus, we get this captain, this One Love armband, right? Note the LGBTQ people, probably for them, sports becomes an important tool for them to go and unify with a larger community in their country or a larger community of fan bases, right? They can probably engage over sports, and that's why it becomes more important to them, because all other and most other avenues have some levels of politicization within those particular things like education or job or whatever, right? I think sports then becomes a unifying factor for them, and that's where they can probably use their identity to separate themselves out from the fan base, but still be a part of the collective. I think they can't go ahead and say that if you are a football fan, you probably just let go of your identity. You don't care about LGBTQ rights. You just care about winning. I don't think that's necessarily true, but rather and here's the nuance in this particular idea. You probably want to be a part of the collective, but also maintain your own individuality as an LGBTQ person. I think this is why sports becomes the most important thing for them, for any LGBTQ person. And also the idea that as Gareth Bale, you probably need to uphold those principles or uphold the actualization of that particular ideal worship that you have created for yourself by being woke in general, right? I think on scale itself, we are also able to impact a larger number of people, primarily because all left-wing, all center-left wing probably support the idea of LGBTQ. However, if you renege on the particular promise, you don't just disillusion that LGBTQ fan base, but you also disillusion the center-left fan base that literally was literally getting catharsis from this idea that you're going to be the one who's going to be the flag bearer. At that point, if you do that, I think this just harms you. And most European people, where literally your entire fan base's base are like leftist and progressive because of like it being a developed world as compared to others, right? I think at that point of time, you just on scale we impact more people because we're able to create bigger discourse, primarily because this particular armband is the most like talked about thing currently. But secondly, on the idea of you not going back on a promise means that you stay principally consistent with one, yourself, your own promises, but secondly, a national identity which is built around the idea of being progressive, a progressive country at the end of the day. That means this debate can only have a delta on abstract concepts which you can't literally like quantify to an extent, but on their side of the house, the idea of winning matches can never actually be quantified because we don't know to what extent the probability can change and why will you unnecessarily win the match, right? You might just get one extra player, but that one extra player can also be the detrimental player. They can literally fuck up in a match. They can miss a penalty. I'm not really sure why that all obviously means that you're going to win the match at that point, right? I think you want to stay true to the Welsh people also because they're the most proximate to you and you literally need to go back home. I think that proximity means that you need to stay true to your ideals and stay true to the ideal creation that you have made. I think the messaging becomes better on our side. The discourse generation increases primarily because you do that one thing that everyone's talking about. You probably go ahead and like bank on a particular thing. That means as a player, you get one catharsis, you stay consistent, but you also get PR incentives. I think for all those three active incentives, we start to take this one on a clear.
Thank you very much. I welcome the third negating speaker.
Hello, I'm visible and audible. Also, I'm cool with recording. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Bluster is not a substitute for analysis, and that's why Gov is out of this debate. Let's talk about their premise. First thing they talk about is backlash. They say Bale will be painted as the reason for all the harms happening to the LGBTQ plus community when he decides to opt out of this promise. I mean, honestly, this is ridiculous. He's not the only person who is opted out. He's not the flag bearer of the LGBTQ plus movement, but like more importantly, he was forced to do this. Otherwise, his country would be screwed over because there's a probability that their best player would not be able to play. And the reasoning for this is the FIFA announcement. I think the more probable way of how the media will act on this information is to look at the culprit, the one that created the situation. And it's not like there isn't transparency regarding what has happened. News outlets have been publishing this information for weeks. The clear and singular enemy that all of them have painted is FIFA and Qatar. So like you're generating discourse regarding this anyways. Fans can clearly see that this is a coerced decision on account of the actor via all of these sources. Like I don't see why backlash occurs. The mechanism from Gov makes no sense. I don't see why you unfollow someone as a result of this if all their stances on all their platforms support the LGBTQ plus community. I don't see why your sponsors decide you aren't worth it anymore. I don't see why you lose the financial benefits as an individual. Extremely unclear what this change looks like in their world. But the second idea is in terms of referees, like it's slightly dropped in third, but first and second do spend a large chunk of time on it. Like it's not certain whether or not the referee would do this. I mean, the threat is probably fairly convincing of the referee doing this. If you got 6 captains who've decided to opt out because they've seen the risks, like I don't know why this is as improbable as Gov says, but their mechanism here is you get bad PR when you red card someone. Again, it's not your choice whether to do it or not. It's FIFA's choice. FIFA is controlled by the money they are getting out of Qatar. And if Qatar has decided what to do, like the ref has to either do this, otherwise he gets fired, which means he'll probably issue the card. Uncertainty of referees is an argument that is pretty irrelevant in this debate. They say the ref will be called out if they do issue a card. But like why? The same mechanism for why this isn't Bale's fault applies to the referee too. Even if the word is may and not will book people, you can still just just book someone and say, hey, FIFA told me to do so. Like at the end of the day, FIFA is going to be the main party that's seen as the fault for all of these things that have happened in the first place. Now I'm going to discuss three things. The first is the frame in terms of the Welsh perspective when it comes to global football. Note that it is by far the most popular sport in Wales, but success on the international scale has been highly limited. The reasoning for this is a lack of infrastructure development to create the best players. And even in cases where infrastructure has been good, it has been poaching of talent by the English team because Welsh players can opt to play for England. At the moment, Welsh football is at the best level it has ever been. They qualified for the out rounds of the Euros 6 years ago, failed to qualify for the World Cup 4 years ago, but they are now back at the global stage. And the problem is the current superstars have already passed the peak of their career and are slowly on the decline, as Gov tells us. What does this mean? It means this is the last fucking chance for these people to actually succeed on the global stage. If they're the best team that this country has made, it's the greatest probability that this country has in order to like have some sort of success at the global stage. But more importantly, this means it's a big deal for fans. For the nation as a whole, the World Cup is a big deal. As the best player on the team, the idol that everyone looks up to, there's huge expectations on you to do your best and fight for national glory. And PM concedes to this when they say that you are the one person that people in the country look up to so much. You're going to be completely vilified if you give up on this one chance that your country is getting. Let me be clear. If you lose, you become scapegoated as a result of this. Like the environment surrounding fan base is inherently one that is toxic and problematic. Like at the point of time a Muslim player representing India makes an error against Pakistan, he's scapegoated by the Indian media. It's going to be just as bad for football players because it's going to be seen as you squandering a match on the biggest stage possible because of a reason that's not even correlated to football. Like it's extremely externally correlated. The fact that you decided to wear a band when you were told not to wear a band. In the cases you still do win a match, yes, it doesn't matter too much, but it's unsure if you win, more so without your best player, because as Gov tells us, sports are wild and unpredictable and anything happen. The second sort of thing to consider here is how does the world of global football look, right? I think the first thing to note is that there is huge corruption associated with FIFA on the whole. Lots of promises made to the footballing public regarding the Qatar World Cup have been reneged on. I agree with Gov with this. It's a very, very fair characterization. But the reasoning for this is Qatar in general and the Qatari government have a huge influence on how the World Cup is occurring throughout. But the problem is that this influence is also seeping through FIFA completely. It doesn't matter how much you protest. Individual players and national organizations don't have controlling influence over FIFA. If that was the case, as DPM says, then the British League is the biggest league in the world, and the World Cup is still happening in Qatar, even though people in Britain think that Qatar is being highly exploitative towards some groups. Like, despite protests for multiple years, not just for LGBTQ plus issues, but for corruption, bribery, and human rights violations, Qatar still hasn't changed at all. The reason why nothing has changed is because there's a disproportionate amount of control it has over the World Cup. I don't see why this is the tipping point. The problem is Gov never illustrates tipping points. They illustrate changes and they tell me why it's good. They never tell me why this is the tipping point that causes that change to occur in the first place. What is the weighing of all of this in terms of the LGBTQ plus community? The first big idea from Gov here is that this generates discourse. I want to note that firstly, the fact that you said you would do this, but then decided not to do this is also something that's going to generate discourse. The question then becomes whether discourse is good or not. Even minor changes that Gov is talking about are contingent on the discourse being good, productive, and Qatari people listening to the discourse. Gov never maps why this is likely to be the case. I want you to note, our alternatives don't completely solve this, but they still are marginally better. Social media protests, you can make verbal comments, you can evaluate whether or not the risk associated with doing this is high or low, and then decide whether or not this is the good starting point for a discourse. They say in response to this, like we can do these things on our side too. I mean, sure you can, but if you are doing this, doesn't that just further decrease Gov's own delta? Like if you can do all this stuff too, why do you need to do something that's much more risky? Like why would any individual ever do that? They inherently prove why our alternatives are better when they try to co-opt them. The problem is Gov never proves this is a good starting point for discourse. You can demonstrate your dissent to a particular situation in multiple ways, but they say only bail is announced you would wear the armband. I mean, read the info slide. It was said it was done in unity with 6 other countries, implying a joint declaration was made. Every single person or all the other countries opt out. But regardless, even getting minute benefits is difficult and unlikely. Note how in Iran, after people in the West started telling women, hey, you should be able to express yourself as much as possible. You shouldn't be forced to wear the burqa. The response from the Iranian government was a crackdown that became much, much worse and much, much more exploitative. The exact same thing applies. It looks like the West is telling this country how it should act in particular circumstances, something this country is not going to take positively as well. Like, I don't think we're contesting that this is a big issue and Bear cares about this issue. I think the thing we're contesting is that this doesn't cause the change that you're trying to tell us it does. The second thing is, how big is the change you want to cause for the LGBTQ plus community? Because Gov isn't clear. They don't show the macro impacts to the community. They don't show this actually results in trickle down benefits to the LGBTQ plus community. All they tell us is that maybe fans might be protected. I mean, I don't really see why that's big enough to outweigh every other thing that we've spoken about. But regardless, I don't see why fans are protected. I don't see why Qatar changes. The third thing to consider here is that the LGBTQ plus community itself are not massively affected by the One Love armband issue. It seems like a grand gesture, but it's still tokenistic insofar it doesn't cause tangible changes. What are people more likely to care about? They're more likely to care about people affected by state laws that curb the freedom of expression in every single context. Qatari laws won't change on their side of the house. The mechanism is unclear. Like 12 years of protest didn't make change. What is the weighing of all of this? Let me be clear, there is a huge risk attached to the situation. And here's how the mental calculus of individuals is likely to function. They evaluate decisions based on considering the risk and benefits that they can take. The risk here is very high, and this is further visualized by the fact that 6 other fellow captains who also support LGBTQ plus rights, who also possess their own distinct mental calculus in terms of the decision-making process, all ended up electing not to wear the armband. Like, again, the benefit that you're talking about is extremely speculative, which is why so many people decided it was not a risk worth taking. I don't see why you wearing this armband then becomes a tipping point for literally anything. The conclusion is simple. The probability of low outcomes in their world is low compared to the individual risk that you're taking in terms of how your own nation perceives this and in terms of making any actual tangible changes for the LGBTQ community. It's clear that sacrifice is worth it in specific contexts, but not if the benefits are speculative. Abstract benefits are worthless in this debate. Gov never proves their importance. Proud to win.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the Neg reply.
Yeah, am I audible? All right, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, LeBron James of soccer gave an assist to United States of America and they scored a goal. It was Bale who equalized, nobody else. He was the one who won a penalty and he was the one who equalized, right? Ronaldo yesterday dived down, could have been easily a yellow card, but just because he's Ronaldo, he got a goal from that. All of those reasons mean that these are pivotal things which they only say are unpredictable. They cannot claim that Bale is not required for this team. So even if Angad is probably Pep Guardiola reincarnate, he can probably still not say that Bale is not important for this team, because this is not about Wales' coach doing this. This is not about this house believes that Bale should do this. This is about what Bale thinks is important for the team. Bale thinks that it's important for him to play this match because he thinks that he's the best hope Wales has got. But even if he doesn't, he wants to do this, right? That's exactly why he's in the World Cup squad. That's exactly why he took the armband as a captain to do this, right? Because of the fact that he wants Bale to do well. He wants the one who makes sure that Bale does well. That is what Bale's calculus is. 3 things. 1, in terms of playing, this is people are risk averse, so is Bale. So even if he can be like risk averse and so on, this directly affects his game, right? Because of the fact that he suddenly cannot dive, because of the fact that to suddenly tackle someone, to snatch the ball from them, if it's near the goal line, right? All of the things he cannot do at a point of which he's already on a yellow card because he knows that the next game is England, right? At that point of time, it's a much more important game to play. But secondly, and more importantly, you do not know how Iran will turn up. Taremi is a great striker. He's on my fantasy team. He can probably score. I'm extremely unsure why there's not likelihood possibility. So all of those means that if things are uncertain, you choose the safest route possible. And that's why we think that the Bale should be able to do this. But secondly, and more importantly, fans. They say these fans are progressive, center, left, and so on. They are talking about the fans who pushed black people out of their communities and harassed them when Bukayo Saka missed a penalty. These are the same fans which they want to talk about. These are the same fans which blamed Black African American players when France didn't qualify out of the group stage in 2002. These are the same fans which they want to talk about, right? It's extremely hypocritical of them to say that these fans necessarily care about the LGBTQ community. But we give them the chance, right? We necessarily believe that, let's say like these people believe about the LGBTQ community. I think it's far more likely that these people are also football fans and care about what Bale does, right? So even if they believe Angad and necessarily believe that, hey, Bale is probably not so important for our team, they don't see it that way. They see that our captain is not playing this match because of a cause he has not been culpable of, because of a cause he cannot really solve on its own. And that's bad for Bale, because that's who is the poor PR argument they want to talk about, because that's when fans criticize you, because you left your team hanging when you needed him, when they needed you the most. Thirdly, let's assume for a second and note government has absolutely no mechanism of why Bale is an advocate for the LGBT community and he cares about it, rather than just joining with 6 or 7 other nations. But even if he does this for most tokenistic purposes and so on, the multitudes of ways to do this. They cannot like they have never shown to you why this whole scenario in which Bale is not able to wear the One Love armband is credited to Bale's fault itself. Like, who exactly is culpable? I think people are more smart, and this comes at third neck, first neck, and second neck as well, that more people think that it is FIFA's fault itself and not Bale's, right? So Bale necessarily doesn't get the backlash they want to talk about. But more importantly, the alternatives they talk about, it's not about n by n plus 1, it's about your n plus 1 adding literally no value to the already pre-existing methods, right? To win this debate, they have to show at least one unique thing, absolute one unique thing which this brings down. Their only argument is that Bale is sad because he broke his promise. No, he didn't have a choice because of the fact that FIFA didn't allow him to do so. We think at that point of paradigm, Bale gets to justify it. Also, more importantly, Bale at least gets to do what he came for, to win, to do well for Wales national football team. Couldn't be more proud to.
Thank you very much. To conclude this debate, I'd like to welcome the affirming leader.
Can you hear me? All right. Sorry, can I just get a confirmation if this is audible? All right, sounds good. 3, 2, 1. The most ridiculous burden push that comes in op-wave is to say you have to be a champion to essentially care about certain things. I don't need to be Greta Thunberg to care about the environment, which is if Bale considers and believes in this at a personal level, goes ahead and makes a public announcement that he should essentially do this, that is enough of a personal incentive for that person to champion for those rights if he himself believes in them in the first place to begin with. We told you down the bench, one, why Bale made that public announcement and deeply cares for LGBTQ rights. And that's why this entire discourse and this has become a controversy and at the tipping point in which Bale isn't want to let go of this so easily. And that's why there is this discourse that should essentially go ahead and like wear this armband or not. But secondly, we told you why specifically within the kind of background that Bale comes from is incredibly progressive, center left, and essentially like is one that is greatly accommodating towards LGBTQ individuals. That's why that is something that's personally ingrained into his psyche, and that's what he inherently cares. Thirdly, we told you why players are not only goal scoring machines, they're role models that people look up to, that have greater identity than themselves than, say, for example, just scoring goals, which is at that point of time, that identity is incredibly important, than like, if not any less important than your ability to score goals. I don't think fans only care about like only scoring goals, as we like rebutted in second and third, because the very fact when you have such visceral imagery in terms of LGBTQ flags and pride flags and armbands, which means your identity also matters as a fan, point at which what you represent, where do you come from. The only thing that they then say is this is important for like essentially Wales to win the match. They say like, oh, perhaps this is the best possible chance Wales have, and like if Wales doesn't do, is essentially a more risk averse and all of that. Note, they never do that weighing at any point of time. Whip completely drops it. Like there's no weighing on Whip absolutely in terms of why that minor reduction in your ability to tackle, that minor reduction in your ability to essentially go ahead and dive in the box. Only Ronaldo dives, let's be real. I don't think everyone dives in that box. At that point of time, why is that comparatively little, like less constrainment of ability largely likely to overturn the amount of backlash you're going to get, point at which when you turn your back against the LGBTQ community, that's never been weighed off. Because Angad does this for you in Whip, which they don't respond to on off-Whip. Angad tells you that because of the fact that Bale is old, he's essentially 33, what he cares more is leaving behind a legacy, leaving behind the image that is not tainted, leaving behind an aura and personality that people can look up to. That is what you care more in your 33s than what you would care in scoring goals. Because if he was a teenager, like for Tottenham Hotspur, he would have cared that for more. But when he's old and on the brink of retirement and already plays for MLS, which means his game is not the prime, his legacy is the prime, and that is the image he wants to protect. That is the weighing that Angad did. No response note for 8 minutes in that Whip speech in terms of why that is not important. That's the basis on which you should clearly take this round. But secondly, why is this likely to taint your image and all the flippant responses that they give? Firstly, they were like, you can displace blame on FIFA otherwise. We told you why media is generally reductive. You can't visualize FIFA. That's an organization. You can visualize the player, what Bale did, because he was the end point of that impact. You can visualize what the referee did, because that was the person who actually executed it. That's why it's very easy to pin blame on individuals directly than, say, for example, nebulously, such as the organization, that you can't conceptually imagine what that would look like as an individual. And media wants to play on the lowest common denominator. That's the analysis you already had on the second speech, which means the media is not rational, because they just asserted it's rational, which it's not. We told you why. It panders to the lowest common denominator of individuals in terms of their cognitive psyches, which means point at which Bale is likely to get immense amount of backlash back home from his own fans, which are largely liberal, moderate, and essentially like center-left. Bale obviously has this choice. They can't do this in reply, oh, Bale has no choice at all, because we told you why this is speculative. One, or the referee actually pulling the yellow card out. Secondly, he's not like directly kicked out of the match. You get one yellow card, you can still play the match at the first place, which is at that point of time, I'm unsure why this is such a like huge jump. Bale obviously has the choice to decide in terms of like whether the morals are more important, which you think is more because he cares about his legacy and image more, because we're not sure whether even if Bale plays, you're going to win the match or not. We told you how unpredictable football is, which means at that point of time, if it's about backlash and scapegoating, he can also get scapegoated if it is not able to score the goal. But he's definitely going to be scapegoated or definitely going to be criticized when he turns his back on something that he publicly announced and now he's denouncing it in the first place, which means that harm is more certain. We told you why you should care about fans more in terms of LGBTQ individuals in these moderate countries who supported you right from your childhood, who essentially contributed to merchandise and sales, etc. These fans matter more. They're more vulnerable in this debate, and you don't want to like principally dissect your identity at the end and create that backlash in your old 30s when you want to maintain that legacy. Insanely proud to propose.
Thank you, everyone, for an excellent debate. Please cross the floor, shake hands, say nice things about each other, and if you could pop out of the room, we'll call you back shortly. Thank you to both teams. We thought this was a very good and well-contested debate. We were unanimous in our decision. We both thought also it was a very close debate, and we gave the debate to the affirming team. Congratulations. Just to walk through, there's no points of general feedback I want to give the teams. This was, in many ways, just quite a classic debate. I think teams were good at engaging. If I were to note one thing, I think the affirming team got onto the key contentions in their debate earlier within their case, and that gave them a slight edge in developing it and didn't put so much onus on the third speaker of the negating team, whom we thought had like very good material, but sometimes went beyond the ambit of what a third speaker can really add to the debate and move too much towards adding significant substantive contributions. So I want to make a few things clear about the setup of this debate before discussing the interests that specifically Gareth Bale, but this hypothetical captain of the Welsh national team at the Qatar World Cup would have. The first is to say that I don't know if the Gareth Bale has since promised, since the original plans, to put on this armband. Obviously, it is clear from the motion that you would wear the armband against the rules, but the announcement that the act may cause a player to be properly booked, that there would be consequences, has obviously caused this cascade. And it is my interpretation of the motion, though I think the reasonable interpretation of the motion is that nothing has been said until this point. You are making the decision afresh, but obviously in the context where before this decision had been announced to book players, you had indicated that you were intending to do this. I'll also note that it was true that you can do many other actions that draw attention to this issue that don't draw the same risk, but also I think was established by the affirming team, don't draw the same benefits. And I want to be clear that I'm not merely defining benefits as materially improving the lives of LGBT people. I think this was potentially too much of a focus from the negating team, when in fact the interests of a captain are slightly wider than that. In fact, the interests of just an activist or someone who wants to make a position, while of course we'd like it to be highly consequentialist and to meet other people's actual material needs, is actually often about public image and public perception and what can be very uncharitably described as virtue signaling, but instead like living in line with your values. I think what was able to be demonstrated by the affirming team, that being on the stage, your largest moment, in a context where the eyes of the world are particularly on you, the action of wearing the armband during the match and running the risk of this consequence is obviously the thing that draws the most attention. I'll note that one of the reasons why this debate was close is NEG does manage to shrink that gap. They explain that there are other things that you can do that you're likely to do in the obviously on the other side as well, but decrease the pivotal importance of this as a movement to help you live in line with your values. Though I would note that this does concede that taking a certain stand is something that you would want to do, and then leads me towards does the fact that this is a pivotal moment and the increased attention that you get from that outweigh obviously the risk that you will get booked in a negative way and that'll harm you. The final thing I want to note and set up is there was some suggestion from the negating team that we need to be making this decision in a very prospective way. This is not just about your decision in the Iran match, it's also about your decision in all the matches subsequent, and we should be weighing the risk there. But I think from the motion it's clear that we're making a decision individually. There's no explanation given to me by the negating team why this needs to be a decision for the entirety of the tournament, or why the costs of wearing it in this one game and not in other games are like significantly increased. So I accepted that this debate was about this decision, which I think puts the affirming team on a little bit more favorable grounds in terms of explaining that this is a game against a weaker opposition and that decreases the risk of loss. So that is the first thing I'm actually going to analyze in this adjudication. What is the risk to your personal performance, and then obviously of the performance of the team overall? I want to note that I did not accept the affirming team's claim that anything can happen in football, and therefore we shouldn't even attempt to try and figure out how we're going to win. I think this is accurately described as nihilism from the affirming team that would justify a broad range of silly decisions in how you set up your soccer team, such as pulling Messi off the bench, because, you know, anything can happen and we don't need to think about winning. I think the negating team demonstrates that the performance of Christian Bale is a meaningful determinant of the ability to ride the randomness against Iran and come out successful, and maybe something that is meaningful. I also accepted that there was not likely to be any ambiguity about being booked. A number of captains have decided to make this decision. The FIFA has indicated very clearly that they're going to do it, and there will be very specific consequences for the ref if they choose not to do it. But what I think the affirming team was stronger on was situating this specifically in the role that Gareth Bale has within his team, and why Gareth Bale, being slightly off his prime, is more cognizant of the way in which he's presenting his legacy going forward, rallying and unifying his team, than he is necessarily about, yes, the limited risk that you'll have to play more gently going forward in this specific match against Iran, where they're already suggested to be at quite an advantage. There was some good late material from the negating team explaining why the captain and Gareth Bale specifically views himself as being particularly pivotal to the success of the team, that they have that belief in the self and the playing ability. And particularly, and this is something that we thought was more difficult to credit, that there'd be incredibly aggressive blame from fans if they were to lose. I think before that point, most of this had been framed through Christian Bale's desire to win the game, rather than the way in which fans can become incredibly ugly, incredibly nasty after a loss for something proximate to a social movement. We thought that this analysis, however, didn't take into account the way in which Christian Bale had been quite effectively set up by the affirming team, someone who bears the values of the Welsh nation. And insofar as there was also a relatively uncontested analysis that the interests, that the values of the Welsh nation are to be inclusive, and that Christian Bale has indicated before this that he is going to be wearing it, which is of course an indicator of the mood of the Welsh nation, is more important to the way that Christian Bale conceives of himself, and also might be more important in terms of rallying the team and playing that symbolic role as the captain, who is no longer necessarily at the peak of his abilities, but can still pull that team together and give them a rallying point, and how that influences individual performance. So at the end of this, I accept that there is a risk. I think this is largely offset by the affirming team, and that then the later claims by the affirming team is what helps them tilt it over. So what is the affirming team able to demonstrate in this debate? The first thing they explain is that the eyes of the world are really upon you, that you can do something that is really powerful in the eyes of the world if you take this particular stand. You might get backlash, particularly from fans who, under the analysis of the affirming team, have a very strong liberal perspective, and that even though FIFA and Qatar might be getting blame as well, which is the key chief pushback from the opposition, it is foregoing an opportunity and exposing Gareth Bale to risk if they let themselves down in the eyes of the nation and don't play that incredibly important role modeling role. This then helps with two things from beyond just a moral perspective, and that's helping Bale specifically cement his financial position, and there was an explanation of who really holds the power, not over the World Cup, which I think there were some good responses to from the negating team, but over people's careers in general, and pointing to the massive outsized role of European football bodies and well, liberal football bodies in general. And so in terms of getting money and financial support, it puts Bale in a pretty strong position. But equally, the prestige that Christian Bale would get out of this, of representing the real values of the nation, taking that really strong stand in line with the values that exist among the particular football community in which he is situated, we found quite compelling analysis as to why Bale's thought processes would align with this. The last thing I want to note in this adjudication is I think the negating team did very good work at limiting the impact of this decision, but that does not itself help them necessarily win the debate, unfortunately. So I think the negating team was able to establish that Qatar is unlikely from this one decision to change, obviously, their position. I thought there was a limited amount of pushback from the affirming team to point out, well, actually, no, when you get negative attention, that does kind of shift things on the margins. But it was effectively explained that this was going to be marginal and might not be enough to outweigh the overall risk to the performance of the team. This is where the consistent characterization, though, of Welsh fans was important. And while we get some pushback at third negating to point me to the negative aspect of fan culture and why they'd be particularly aggressive if obviously the chance that you lose does come to pass, the significant progressiveness of Welsh fans, particularly younger Welsh fans who might be LGBT, there would be a significant effect on them. And in the context of conceiving as your role as the captain, as being part of this trajectory of sports being unifying and sports being something really meaningful to those fans, that you are in a culture that heavily encourages you to prioritize, we think the affirming team is able to just take it over that stronger analysis that comes out towards the end of the negating team. Thank you both to both teams. I'm going to end the recording now.